HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Germany, A History by Franics Russell. Read by A.T. Chandler. 1. The Tribal Heartland. Germany on the map looks today as it has always looked, like a heartland, to use that much-abused geopolitical term. First it was a region, then an idea, and finally a nation in the modern sense. About the year AD 96, Tacitus described Germania Magna as separated from Gaul, Raetia, Switzerland, and Pannonia, Bohemia, by the rivers Rhine and Danube, from Sarmatia, Poland and European Russia, and Dacia, Hungary, by mutual suspicion. He found the climate to be harsh and the scenery unattractive, with a lot of forests and polluted swamps. The Germans are an indigenous people, he wrote, very little affected by admixture with other races through immigration or intercourse. He admired the simplicity of their tribal life and described them as fair-haired, fiercely blue-eyed people who hated peace. Caesar had written earlier that the whole life of the Germans is spent in hunting and the practice of war. The Germans of Caesar and Tacitus are not the modern Germans, although Wagner, William II, and Hitler like to think so. That original mixture has become so weakened that it has lost most of its identity. In fact, Germany is one of the most racially mixed countries in Europe. Its citizens include the pre-Indo-European population, the Celts, the Germanic tribes, and the Slavs. The country reflects the cultural patterns of these people. The West and Southwest, with their Roman-founded cities like Cologne and Trier, are Latin and Celtic in character. The people of Central and Southern Germany are more Celtic than Latin. This blends with the Slavic in the southeast, while the East has produced the Slavic-Germanic mixture so characteristic of Prussia. Even though the link between present-day Germans and the blue-eyed tribesmen of Tacitus has weakened, German history begins in the forests between the Rhine and the Vistula. From this tribal heartland, Goths and Vandals moved south into the Mediterranean countries, the Burgundians into the Rhone region, the Franks into Gaul, and finally the Saxons invaded England. According to Tacitus, the first tribesmen to cross the Rhine and drive the Celts out of Gaul were the Tungri. They referred to themselves as Germani. Julius Caesar had pushed the frontiers of Rome to the Rhine with his Gallic conquests. This established the limes, the fortified Roman boundary against the barbarians that extended from the Rhine as far as the Danube, which it touched at Regensburg. The western and southwestern lands within its limits became parts of the Roman Empire, and many of the tribesmen became Roman soldiers and even Roman citizens. After Augustus added Raetia and Pannonia to the empire, he then dispatched his general Publius Quinctilius Varus to Germany with 3 legions to extend the Roman boundaries in tribute to the Elbe. The chief of the Cherusci, Arminius, known in German legend as Hermann, had served as an officer in the Roman auxiliary. He persuaded many of the recently subjected tribes to unite with him in opposing the Roman advance. In AD 9, in the Teutoburg forest, he ambushed and wiped out 3 legions, some 20,000 men, or roughly 1/10 of the whole Roman army. Though Augustus raised new legions to strengthen the frontier, he made no further attempt to extend Roman rule beyond the limes. The tribes of Germany combined into 5 major groups: the Frisians along the Baltic, the Alemann of Swabian stock on the upper Rhine, the Franks, whose very name signified free of the Romans, the Saxons between the Weser and the Elbe, and the Thuringians, south of the Saxons. From the many tribal dialects, 2 major speech forms developed: High German in the south, which would over the centuries become the standard literary speech, and in the north, Low German, a speech that remained a dialect but that is much closer to the Anglo-Saxon than High German. Deutsch, the German chosen word for things German, originally meant popular speech as opposed to Latin. For over 400 years, the Romans remained on the west bank of the Rhine facing Germany. Citizens in the border areas accepted Roman rule as part of the order of things. From Augst, Augusta Raurica, a few miles above Basel, Basilia, to Cologne, Colonia Agrippinensis, named in honor of Nero's mother, Roman garrisons developed into cities. Oberwessel was first the military station Vasolvia. Bacharach, with its vineyards, evolved from Arabaki, altar of Bacchus. Strasbourg, as Argenturatum, became a legion headquarters. Koblenz, ad confluentes, guarded the junction of the Rhine and the Moselle. Trier, Augusta Treverorum on the Moselle, founded by Augustus on a tribal site, would become an imperial city, the northern headquarters for a succession of emperors after Diocletian's division of the empire in AD 269. Within their fortified cities, the Romans built palaces, baths, and amphitheaters, and even luxurious villas in the more open country. Because it was easier to divide the Germans than to conquer them, it became Roman policy to provoke quarrels among the tribes and to flatter the more powerful chiefs. German life within the forest region east of the Rhine remained almost unchanged during the Roman centuries. Tribes combined, fought each other, combined again, and penetrated the fortified frontiers in brief and terrible raids. They created no cities of their own. Even though they led primitive lives, the Germans still needed items that the sophisticated Roman traders were ready to supply. German women demanded cooking and eating utensils, while their warrior husbands found that they preferred Italian wine to native brewed beer. In exchange for the goods they wanted, the Germans offered Baltic amber, women's hair, and slaves. Ever since Arminius's great victory, they had known it was possible to conquer the Roman legions. Now, with growing trade, the Germans became more aware of the empire's cities and provinces. The warmer regions were especially appealing to them. They also realized how vulnerable the border garrisons were to sudden attack. The tribes of Germany continued to be relentless, always probing for weak spots in the limes. Their road to expansion ran south and west until it came up against the Roman frontier. Again and again they breached that barrier. In 167, a host of Germanic tribes, spearheaded by the Quadi and the Marcomanni, crossed the Danube to ravage and plunder Raetia, Pannonia, Dacia, and Noricum, overwhelming the Roman army that tried to stop them. Only when Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius took charge of the battle were the legions able to push the barbarians back across the Danube. Meanwhile, the Alemann, a dangerous enemy with a new name that meant all men, appeared in the upper Rhine region. They were a confederacy rather than a single tribe. On their first appearance in history, Emperor Caracalla repelled them when they tried to invade Raetia in 213. 20 years later, they attacked the Roman defenses with such force that Emperor Alexander Severus had to stop his campaign against the Persians to deal with them. After his assassination, the rough campaigner Maximinus succeeded him. His troops advanced by forced marches to the country of the Alemann, destroyed their fields and houses, and finally defeated them deep in their own territory. This year of victory, 238, marked the last great Roman campaign to defend the Rhine-Danube frontier. Its peaceful effect lasted 20 years. The Alemann smashed through the Roman fortifications along the Danube, overwhelmed the Roman garrisons, and swept over the southern region. Their troops even managed to cross the Alps into Italy, where the armies of Emperor Gallienus finally managed to defeat them near Milan. However, the Alemann still controlled the region just north of the Alps and the passes to Italy. While the Alemann were spreading south, the Franks appeared on the lower Rhine. Soon, the Romans would fear them even more than the Alemann. They were freemen, a league of nations composed of the tribes and smaller clans of the region. The first Frankish attack on the Rhine frontier came in 253, and soon the whole west bank was in their hands. Vast bands of Franks encountered no resistance as they crossed the river into Gaul, devastating the regions from the Rhine to the Pyrenees and even pushing into Spain. All Europe then feared the Germans. Eventually, the Roman legions became strong enough to force the Franks back, and the Rhine once again became the dividing line. but it was an uneasy boundary with many weak areas as the empire continued its decline. Meanwhile, far east of Germany itself, in the region of the Black Sea, the Goths, another Germanic people, were preparing to make their indelible mark on history. Originating in Scandinavia, the Goths had migrated to the Baltic coast. Then, from the Gulf of Danzig, they had moved up the Vistula to the neighborhood of the Marcomanni. At a later date, they moved on to the northern coast of the Black Sea, drawing other Germanic peoples to them as they divided east and west into the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. A bloody haze seemed to hang over Europe for the next 2 centuries as tribes continued to relocate and conquer new territories. It was during this time that some very significant events occurred. The emergence of Christianity as the state religion in the 4th century under Emperor Constantine and his temporary reunification of the Eastern and Western empires, the sack of Rome itself by the Visigoths and again by the Vandals, and the thrust of the Asiatic Huns at the gates of Europe, threatening the whole West. Early in his reign, Constantine relentlessly tried to suppress the restless Franks, capturing 2 of their chiefs and allowing the beasts in the arena to devour them. He was equally firm with the Alemanni and their allies, while also strengthening the fortresses along the frontier. The Limes remained quiet until his death in 337. During the years of civil war that followed, the tribes again overran the left bank of the Rhine, capturing Cologne and penetrating far into the interior of Gaul, plundering until nothing of value remained. Finally, the young Caesar Julian took command in Gaul, drove back the Franks, defeated 7 Frankish kings, recaptured Cologne and Strasbourg, and was on the way to bringing peace to the entire Rhine country until civil conflict forced him to return to Rome in 361. At the time of Diocletian, citizens began referring to the emperor's successor designate as Caesar. Again, the Franks and the Alemanni made raids across the Rhine, and again the Roman legions drove them back. The Western Emperor Valentinian, who ruled from 364 to 375, restored the Rhine frontiers and further strengthened and improved the defenses. Under his son and successor, Gratian, the Rhine region remained relatively peaceful. When the Alemanni crossed the Rhine in force in 378, they briefly broke the peace. Gratian overwhelmed them near Colmar and Alsace. As the Huns moved westward, terror swept the Gothic nations. The Ostrogoths rallied and tried to hold back the relentless Asiatics at spear point, but the Huns were able to subdue the Ostrogoths. The Visigoths panicked and begged to be allowed to enter the empire. Valens gave them permission. In improvised boats, they swarmed across the Danube to the plains of the Thrace, like the rain of ashes from an eruption of Etna. Unfortunately, the lesser Roman officials showed none of Valens' generosity. They harried and abused the tribesmen until inevitably the Visigoths, who through Roman negligence had not been disarmed, revolted. Even the Gothic auxiliaries joined the rebellion. Valens led his forces against the insurgents and had a few initial successes, but the Goths overwhelmed the Romans in 378 at Adrianople, destroying 2/3 of the Roman army and killing Valens. The Battle of Adrianople shook the empire to its foundations. Even though the Goths did not follow up their victory, it was now obvious that the 5 centuries of struggle between Romans and Germans were drawing to a close. At the beginning of the 5th century, many German tribes began to invade the provinces of the Western Empire. Sometimes, as Gratian had done with the Ostrogoths and Huns invading Pannonia, the empire was able to make uneasy alliances with his enemies by yielding land and payments. In 401, the Vandals, who had invaded Raetia, gained access to much of the area under the condition that they serve in the Roman army. 4 years later, Ostrogoths and Vandals with related tribes pushed across the Alps. It was the skill of 2 tribal generals in the Roman service, one a Goth and the other a Hun, that saved Italy. The following year, the Vandals devastated Gaul, forcing the Frankish tribes aside. With no other armies to oppose them, they continued on into the Iberian Peninsula. The Burgundians drove out the Alemanni along the lower Main River, and the Alemanni, in turn, invaded and conquered Roman Upper Germany. Under Theodoric I, the Visigoths had established the Kingdom of Toulouse, a Gothic state within the Roman Empire, in which the Goths received 2/3 of the land. In eastern Gaul, the Burgundians became Roman alliances, as the Ostrogoths had in Pannonia. The pattern repeated itself throughout the fading empire. Most of the German tribes submitted to the Hun king Attila, just as both the Western and Eastern empires felt they needed to pay him tribute. By their submission and by serving in the Hun army, the Germans had at least been able to preserve their independence. It was the Visigoths who proved that the Huns were not invincible after Attila invaded Gaul in 451 with a large army. Confronting him at Troyes, the Visigoths under King Theodoric fought the Hun army to a standstill. The following year, a more cautious Attila took the easier course of invading Italy. But before he reached Rome, the plague swept through his army. When an embassy of Romans led by Pope Leo I arrived at his camp, he used this as an excuse to retire. With his death the following year, the Huns' empire dissolved. Even if the Huns had not forced the German tribes to move westward, the growing pressure of the German tribes from the forest would have inevitably engulfed the Limes. As the German population increased, the number of Roman and Celtic survivors declined, thus making it impossible for them to cultivate all of the land. It was a vacuum the Germans were bound to fill. They crossed the ancient barrier and established kingdoms that still kept a minimal allegiance to imperial Rome. At the same time, they brought their kings, laws, customs, and Arian Christianity with them. German tribes settled beyond Gaul in Spain and Africa. Germans filled the ranks of the legions and rose to the highest offices, even that of supreme commander. In the process, the Germans beyond the Rhine gradually became more like the Romans. Tacitus, in his account of Germany, listed more than 40 tribes. 4 centuries later, even their names had vanished. Replacing them were the more familiar designations of tribal clusters, the Franks, the Saxons, and the Alemanni. From their capital at Toulouse, the Visigoths had expanded southward over most of the Iberian Peninsula. East of the Rhone lay the Burgundian kingdom, with the neighboring Alemanni settled in what would later be Alsace. The Ripuarian, riverbank, and Salian, seacoast Franks occupied the lower Rhine to the North Sea. North of them were the Saxons. The Vandals had crossed the Mediterranean to North Africa. After the day in 476 when Odoacer deposed Emperor Romulus Augustulus, the Roman Empire of the West came to an end, and the Ostrogoths ruled Italy. Other more vaguely defined tribes of free Germans clung to their ancestral life in the forests of Central Europe. In the new Germanic states, kingship became the accepted and only practical form of government as kings developed from the chiefs of the merging tribes. Yet the new kingdoms followed the Roman administrative customs and procedures. The imperial structure continued under Odoacer and persisted through the centuries until renewed by Charlemagne. Under the new rulers, most of the Roman civil service remained intact. The old Roman provincial aristocracy, having lost much of their land, became high officials for the Germanic kings, as well as bishops for the church, even though Germans controlled the armies. Roman literary figures took their places in Germanic courts. However, barbarians and Romans could not marry. Of course, it was not possible for these Germanic kingdoms to live together peacefully. Inevitably, one tribe would dominate the rest. In the middle of the 6th century, the Emperor of the East, Justinian I, annihilated 2 of the contenders, the kingdoms of the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, and the Franks became the dominant entity. The history of the Franks is the prehistory of the modern German people. With their empire, they laid the foundations of both France and Germany, and the Salian Franks took the leading role. From the shores of the northern sea, the Salian Franks moved gradually south, sometimes clashing with the Romans, but still remaining united. At the beginning of the 5th century, they no longer recognized Rome's authority and rejected both the Latin language and the Christian religion. In spite of the Franks' fierce love of combat, The fortified Roman road that ran from Arras and Cambrai to Cologne still held them in check. One of their chiefs, Clodion, after an initial defeat by the Romans, rallied and led his army against Cambrai, capturing the town and gaining control of the Roman road. The Franks could now march south as far as the Somme. His son, Meroveus, succeeded Clodion. The founder of the Merovingian dynasty, he sought the support and protection of the Roman Empire and sent a contingent of Franks to oppose the invasion by Attila. Meroveus's son Childeric fought beside Roman generals in the valley of Loire against the Visigoths and devoted himself to policing Gaul on Rome's behalf. Childeric's son, Clovis, was only 15 when he became one of the Salian chiefs. For 5 years he watched and waited before he led other Frankish kings in attacking the cluster of Gallo-Roman cities between the Somme and the Loire that the Roman official Syagrius ruled. Clovis occupied Soissons, extended his rule through Belgium, and overcame the cities along his route until he finally reached Paris. An ambitious young man, he showed kindness in his conquests. He permitted the Gallo-Romans to stay on their land and respected the Christian religion, even though he was a pagan. He married a Christian princess from Burgundy, Clotilda, who did her best to convert him. Finally, on Christmas Day 496, he received baptism into the Catholic Church and ordered his people to follow him. Whatever the depth of his belief, he was well aware of the practical advantages of the support he would gain from the powerful bishops in his struggle against the heathen tribes and the Visigoths by taking this step. Though Christians, they had easily adopted the Arian heresy denying the divinity of Christ. Such support had been welcome when he raised an army to attack the Alemands. In a completely successful campaign, he drove them out of Alsace and to the high valleys of the Alps. Clovis was determined to make Gaul a single state that he would rule. Although he failed to subject Burgundy, he next turned his attention to the Visigoths, routing them completely near Poitiers and killing the king, Alaric II, with his own hand. After the battle, he again treated the conquered territory with mercy, seizing no land but merely requiring the Arians to submit to the Orthodox faith. He established the seat of his government in Paris. As a measure of caution, he ordered the assassination of his rival Salian chiefs, while at the same time asserting his sovereignty over the Ripuarian Franks. Before he died, Clovis had conquered nearly all of Gaul except Burgundy and Provence. By driving out the Alemands, he had extended his authority beyond the Rhine and had confirmed that authority by codifying the Salic law. Yet the shadow of the empire haunted him too. After the Emperor of the East had made him an honorary consul, he assumed the symbolic purple mantle and tunic. Clovis had regarded the Frankish kingdom as a family inheritance and left it divided equally among his 4 sons. They carried on their father's work of conquering Gaul by dominating Burgundy and annexing Provence, but they also plotted against one another. After his brothers died, Clothar was in sole possession of Clovis's kingdom. Clothar, in turn, divided his Frankish inheritance among his 4 sons in 4 capital cities, Metz, Orléans, Paris, and Soissons. The king of Paris soon died, and Gaul once more, as in Caesar's day, became 3 separate entities. The Gallo-Roman Nuestria in the west, the Germanic Austrasia in the east, and Burgundy with its capital at Orléans. The early 7th century was a period of decay and decline, a dark age. It included the reunification of the Frankish kingdom under Clothar's grandson Clothar II, the succession of his powerful and determined son Dagobert, and after Dagobert's death, the decline of the Merovingian dynasty into the juvenile Rois Fainéants, the do-nothing kings. These events prepared the way for the succeeding house of Pepin and Charlemagne. In the time of the weak Merovingian child kings, the chief officer of the household, the mayor of the palace, was the authority figure. Under their individual palace mayors, the separateness of Nuestria, Austrasia, and Burgundy became more and more evident as royal authority eroded and the independence of the nobility increased. Most notable were the mayors of Austrasia, who soon made that office hereditary. The founder of this mayoral dynasty was Pepin, mayor of the palace when the young Dagobert was merely king of Austrasia. When Pepin's son Grimwald, as mayor, prematurely attempted to seize the throne, the Austrasian nobles stopped him and executed him. But a quarter of a century later, in 687, Pepin II, grandson of Pepin, emerged with almost absolute power in Austrasia and fought against the rival mayor of Nuestria, defeating him at Tertry, near Orleans, a battle that marks the real end of the Merovingians. The second Pepin had once more united the kingdom. During his lifetime, he appointed his grandsons as mayors in Nuestria and Austrasia. After his death, they were not strong enough to resist the spreading anarchy, and it fell to Pepin's illegitimate son Charles Martel to restore order. Charles ruled forcefully in the manner of his father, leading an army against the defiant Neustrians, making himself master of Burgundy, appointing his own courts and bishops, and for some years governing without a king. When the Moors invaded Gaul from Spain, which they had conquered in 711, Charles defeated them. In the great battle that took place in 732 near Tours, the Moorish leader died and his troops failed to advance. Following this victory, Charles Martel became known as Charles the Hammer. He forced the Saxons to pay tribute, abolished the troublesome Duchy of Alemannia, and granted safe conducts to Boniface and other Anglo-Saxon missionaries intent on converting the pagan Germans in Thuringia and beyond. Though still without a royal title, Charles followed the custom of the Frankish kings before him. He divided his lands between his sons, Charlemagne and Pepin. Austrasia, Alemannia, Thuringia, and the suzerainty of Bavaria going to the former, Nuestria, Burgundy, Provence, and the suzerainty of Aquitaine to the latter. In a suzerainty, a powerful region controls the foreign policy and international relations of a vassal state while allowing the subservient nation to have internal autonomy. After 6 years of joint rule, Charlemagne abdicated to become a monk, and Pepin III became the sole mayor of the palace. Eager now to become an actual king as well as ruler, he sent an embassy to Rome to ask Pope Zacharias if he had the right to assume the kingship. The Pope replied that because he was king in fact, it would be well for him to be king in name. To confirm this among the laity, Pepin fell back on the tribal tradition of calling an assembly of the Franks. This assembly unanimously chose him king. With the last Merovingian shut up in a monastery, Archbishop Boniface anointed and crowned Pepin, chosen by his people and by the grace of God. Shortly before his death, Pepin divided his kingdom between his sons, Charles and Charlemagne. A month after their father's death in 768, these two men became kings. 3 years later, Charlemagne died without leaving a mark on history. His brother, on the other hand, would influence the historical development of Europe. As Charlemagne, as Carolus Magnus, as Karl de Grosse, the resurrector of the Roman Empire of the West, he became a father figure, the legendary hero of both France and Germany. 2. Charlemagne, the visionary. Charlemagne was born in 742, although there is no record of the day or the place. His mother, Bertrada, Pepin's chief mistress and later his wife, became the first Carolingian queen of Frankland. We know nothing about the childhood and youth of Charles, her firstborn son. Einhard, who served as Charlemagne's secretary for almost a quarter of a century and later as his chronicler, thought it would be folly to write a word concerning Charles's birth and infancy, or even his boyhood, for nothing has ever been written on the subject, and there is no one alive now who can give information of it. Charles made his first appearance in history at the age of 12 when his father, the most Christian king of the Franks, sent him and his brother to Valais in the Swiss Alps to meet the aged Pope Stephen II and bring him to their father's palace. Stephen, long harassed by the Lombards, the Germanic conquerors of northern Italy, was practically a prisoner in Pavia. Their king, Aistulf, finally allowed him to travel northward across the Alps to Frankland. At the Valais Abbey, The ailing and travel-weary pontiff met a smiling, fair-haired, tall boy who introduced himself as King Pepin's elder son, Charles. The entourage then continued on to the court of Pepin, where Pope Stephen tried to enlist help in an anti-Lombard alliance, because Pepin believed that...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?